Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. Oh my, it's season 3. No, I can't believe it either. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? Yes, the award-winning counterfactual history podcast that tops the What If charts is back. I wouldn't worry about what award exactly, but enough of me. It's over to the guys.
Hello and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. Yes, it's season 3. We had a little break, but we're back now and we've got some exciting podcasts to present to you during this series. So hopefully you will enjoy them. But anyway, I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
I should have done that the other way around, really, introduced us and then done the stuff about season 3 and this award-winning podcast. But we don't talk about what award and
What award? Indeed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the What Award, and obviously it's the number one counterfactual podcast on the internet. Prove us wrong. That's always our
Indeed.
question, isn't it?
No
Prove us
pedantic,
wrong.
no pedanticness about what's a counterfactual. We know what it means.
Right. Okay then. So, Ian, what are we going to start off season 3 with today?
So we're going to talk about the Flight of the Earls, which was an Irish historical event in the 1600s that, arguably resulted in the plantation of Northern Ireland and the influx of a reasonably large number of Protestant-type people into Northern Ireland, which may or may not have caused a problem later on. Well, it did cause a problem later on, but let's look at the implications as to what it may have not done, etc., etc. So it's the Flight of the Earls. It's relatively obscure, but friends be listening in Ireland is probably quite familiar with it.
Yeah, well, you'd like to think that part of the history that you taught in school would have included this. I mean, whether it included...
So I don't know what sort of history you got taught, but I didn't get taught Irish history. But
you were talking about our Irish listeners. I mean, unless you're talking...
Oh, that's what you mean. Sorry, yeah, that's what you mean. I thought you meant us.
Oh, not us. I'd never heard of it until I actually heard it was mentioned on the...
Never heard of it until you heard of it. Well, you can't really argue with that.
Well, no, I heard of it. It wasn't something I was aware of until...
No.
It was raised on another podcast, and I was thinking, well, that's something I'd never heard of.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it until you mentioned it to me 2 weeks ago. So,
yeah, but
I have done a bit of, studying of it. Yeah.
So it's quite a, like you say, a niche one, but ultimately could have had fairly big implications. Or it did have fairly big implications. Or that's what we're going to discuss as to whether it would have or it wouldn't have. I mean, if we start, so the start of this whole sort of emphasis was what they called the 9 Years' War, which was 1593 to 1603, and which ultimately was another one of these where Ireland wanted to essentially rebel against the English crown, but the army of the time, which was Elizabeth, I believe, was that? Yeah, that was mainly Elizabeth. Didn't she die 1601? I can't remember. I looked it up and I can't remember now. I think it's 1601 she died. So it was the Tudor. So the Tudor monarchy conquered Ireland as part of this 9-year war, and one of the outputs or one of the issues that came out of it was, as you mentioned, the flight of the Earls. Now, the flight of the Earls was essentially 2 key Earls, Hugh O'Neill and Rory O'Donnell. One was the Earl of Tyrone, and the other was the first Earl of Tyrconnell, if I've pronounced that right. And I think it's in some ways it's a bit unknown as to why they left, but they essentially packed everything up and left their lands and fled ultimately to Italy, with the main aim of trying to get foreign powers to agitate against the English crown so they could get Ireland back. I believe that sort of thing. Anyway, they were trying to think of the word now. Not foment some sort of rebellion against the crown, which ultimately didn't happen. But what it did do was leave at the time. So James I was James I of England, James VI of Scotland. No, yeah, it was James VI of Scotland, James I of England. It left him with an opportunity within Ireland. I mean, I believe that plantations, the plantation of Ulster wasn't unique. There were other plantations going on, but they'd but they were always small. It was a sort of group of people here, or colonists here, and a group of colonists there. It was never a sort of large scale deployment of colonists in a specific large area, which is what happened with the plantation of Ulster. So so what we're saying is, if they hadn't have left, I mean, so sorry, I'm just going to take one step back. One of the things which is, just one of those historical facts was that these two earls were both, and their lands were considered the most Irish, in terms of most Gaelic. They were very strongly Catholic. In fact, seen as the most Catholic, Orthodox Catholics in Ireland. Strangely enough, it's funny when
So
you think
who were?
Hugh O'Neill and Rory O'Donnell.
Uh-huh.
So that part of Ireland was considered as the most extreme of the Irish Catholics, whereas other parts of Ireland were seen as a bit more moderate, which is probably why they left. Who knows? That's why they left, because they felt they were going to be their lands were going to be confiscated anyway. Who knows? Or that they were going to be invaded again by the English. Who knows? But ultimately, it was a very rural place, very, very Catholic. So anyway, if we then move forward to what was happening with James. So James was still doing plantations, and the idea was to pacify the locals and to civilize them, which obviously seems daft these days, but very, very much of the time, no doubt. So if they hadn't have left, so I'm just going to come back to, I'll be editing out all these erms. Will I edit out the bit where I said I'm editing them out? I don't know. Anyway. So I should have that note like you've got where it says no erms.
Oh,
Or your nose.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Got rid of mine.
I think I'm
So,
Yeah.
Have I lost my train of thought?
something about civilizing. I'm sure they should say that. I'm sure they consider themselves reasonably civilized. To be
Of course
honest,
they did. Yeah,
yeah.
right. This was just about Catholics and Protestants.
Yeah.
So James I wanted to to provide benefits to certain of his lords by allowing them land in Ireland. And one of the things that the flight of the Earls enabled him to do, he in theory, if they hadn't have gone, he could have confiscated their land. So it's a bit debatable as to whether he would or he wouldn't have. But if in our scenario, let's assume he didn't. But in the real world, they did leave, and he confiscated their lands because he considered them traitors. And then that enabled him to parcel out the land to all his other friends in Scotland and in England to say, oh, well, you've been doing a good job for me. Here's some land in Ireland, but by the way, you've got to send colonists over. And so there was English and Scottish. I think there were more. I don't know. I mean, you might know this, Ian. Do you think there were more Scottish colonists than English colonists?
I think so. I think there were, but I mean, apart from anything else, if we look at the, I know there was subsequent layers of immigration, but if you look at the makeup now, the names in Northern Ireland who are Protestants are mostly Scottish names. Obviously, there's some English names there as well, but yeah. So he was obviously James VI of Scotland, so he had.
Was it James VI? That's right. I'm getting confused.
He had large estates distributed in Scotland as well as in England.
Yeah. So we're in 1609, and the plantation. Let's assume it still happens, but it wouldn't have been the same. So instead of it being a large scale, there's a lot of land. There's no, there's no landowners as such who are there. I've confiscated it. I'm just going to hand it out to people. It would have been, okay, don't like the people who are there. We're going to be might have to be a bit more careful about where we plant these colonies. So there might still have been some sort of plantation, but it wouldn't have been on the same scale and wouldn't have had the same impact. And ultimately, right, so that's where we're going to start from in terms of Ireland was still going to be a fully Catholic. It's difficult to say whether it's Catholic. There wouldn't have been a large-scale plantation in a region of Ireland. I think that would have been a fair assumption had the Earls not flighted to mainland Europe.
Yeah, 100%. So what we incorrectly consider as Ulster, which does include some parts of Ireland proper, the state today, wouldn't have been wouldn't have had such a large Protestant population, and there's a negligible Protestant population in the rest of Ireland, notwithstanding the ruling classes, the majority of which were Protestant, purely because being a Catholic was you weren't able to be a lord within the king's system, and you couldn't even be a member of Parliament until the 1800s at some point. So you couldn't be a member of the ruling class being a Catholic, because by definition you weren't allowed to be. So the ruling class were Protestant, but the majority of people were Catholic, apart from the 5 counties of what is now Northern Ireland. But to a certain extent, that was gerrymandered. So let's not get into how many Catholics versus Protestants there are.
No.
But there was a lot of Protestants in Northern Ireland, and there wasn't in the rest of the island of Ireland.
No, that's right. So one of the things that it did enable, at the time, the British to have then, because it was James I, was to almost have like a base. So you've got a sort of loyal to the crown type part of the island. So I don't think of the bloody word. Get too old. Territory. So you got a territory which is very, in fact, is in favour of the crown. So you got something where if there is trouble, it's easy to try and resolve it, or to send troops to quell any particular issues. If you didn't have that, which we wouldn't in our scenario, Ireland as a country, I suspect that they would have been agitating for independence or some form of self-rule possibly earlier than what did happen. I don't know what your thoughts on that. I mean, obviously there's a long time between in the mid 1600s and then the Easter Rising and all this type of stuff. But
well, I mean, the obvious thing is there would be no opposition in the island. I mean, the island of Ireland would have no opposition to home rule and independence, because other than the landed gentry and the ruling class, so there would be no counterbalance at all. So many conversations were held in the 1880s about Irish home rule, and well into the 1900s. In the First World War, to put the kibosh on it, and the reason that it's deemed to be a problem was because of the Protestant people in the north, and they armed themselves and organised themselves into paramilitary organisations, as we would call them today, militias, as they were probably known in the day, under a variety of strange characters. Certain elements of the British Army stationed in Ireland. This is the officers obviously threatened to not follow orders if sent to confront these individuals in the north, otherwise known as a mutiny. And there was a mutiny at the Curragh, which is just outside Ireland, outside Dublin, racecourse there now. So that wouldn't have happened because there wouldn't have been anybody to oppose. So there would have been so there would have been little or no machinations in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But whether it would have persuaded the landed gentry to give up their and the political class, who were mostly all Protestant by virtue of not being allowed to be a Catholic until I think about 1840, 1830. Whether that would have persuaded them any more quickly is debatable, because they were very much focused on what was happening in their backyard, and their backyard was where their backyard was. So it was Dublin and whatever, Cork and all the rest of it. So the fact that there was a bunch of Protestants in the north probably didn't register with them particularly, the ruling class, that is. So they would have, or not in our scenario, so they would have still wanted to hold on to power.
So in that sense, the timeline for independence is unlikely to change a great.
It might have brought it forward before the First World War, and it might have been done more peacefully. I mean, the British Liberal government had a series of bills being prepared to give Irish home rule. So Irish home rule versus Ireland, the so-called independence of Ireland was slightly odd. If you recall, it was called the Irish Free State until about 1947. Now, what does that actually mean? A very strange term, and I think it was still part of the Commonwealth. So slightly odd terminology. And then home rule again, slightly odd, still part of the United Kingdom, but completely separate legislature. Well, that's not right. Legislature. You know what I mean? And Parliament. And Parliament. But again, still having the King or the Queen, whoever would have been the King mostly by then, certainly Queen Victoria maybe just as the head of state. Now again, that's just a rung on a ladder. But so all that was quite peculiar in the original timeline. I suspect it could have got home rule when the British Liberal Party wanted to give it to it, because there wouldn't have been these Ulster Unionists, as they became, who were very much in cahoots. That's unfair. They were in public consultation with the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party, which is the alternative government, or the opposition as we would call it now, the Conservative Unionist Party, the clue's in the name. But again, they wouldn't exist. So there would be nobody for the Conservative Party to ally with. Why would the Conservative Party might have objected to Irish Home Rule? But as they had nobody bending their ear, for whatever expression, there's a better expression which has just escaped me, but as they had nobody, the expression always came to me, but anyway, they had nobody talking to them about it all the time and saying this is a bad thing. Some people would have had an opinion, but many people wouldn't have done. I'm talking about the politicians in the Conservative Party. So they probably wouldn't have opposed it, and Irish Home Rule would have come along in the 1890s, bearing in mind the First World War, there was never conscription in Ireland. The island of Ireland, both World War, there was never conscription. Whether a significant number of Irishmen would have volunteered.
Well, I was looking at it. I looked that up.
Yeah.
So there were 200,000 volunteers from Ireland for the First World War, and it's so I mean, obviously it's a big conjecture, but it would be I don't know what we think if Ireland was in the our counterfactual universe, how many would have volunteered? Would it have been 200,000? It probably would have been less.
Well, I suppose you've got to ask yourself why people volunteer. I mean, many people volunteer to get a decent, 3 square meals a day.
Well, some did.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We're talking about Pat's homes, but
yeah.
I mean, very few people, people volunteer to get with drudgery and all the rest of it. Yeah, some people volunteer down in that era of patriotism. Very few people volunteered out of Belgium being outraged, as the expression went at the time. But yeah, so it's interesting to know how much that would be. So let's take a step back.
Yeah, go on. Yeah,
I was going to say that
because there was something else I was going to take a step back.
Yeah, so I think Irish Home Rule, which is not independence as such, but Irish, which is but it was a significant change. Irish Home Rule, you vote for who you like, have your own Prime Minister. The King still, or the Queen, is depending when it happened, is still the Queen Victoria is still the head of state. You're still contributing to the defence of the British Isles, so you're still being taxed to one degree or another by London. That would have come. I think that would have come because there would be nobody opposing it in Ireland. Nobody opposing it in Ireland, apart from the usual type of people who oppose anything in any country, right-wing reactionaries who don't like anything. I think that would have gone through. So Ireland would have had Home Rule, and that would have been the first rung on its way to being a fully independent country within X years, 15, 20 or something, whatever, probably. So I think, yes, it would have quietened everything down. That's not. I mean, lots of things happened in Ireland which had nothing to do with Protestants and Catholics, but it happened in the rest of the UK and most of Europe as well, which was rapacious landlords forcing people out of farms and all the rest of it. That was a big thing in Ireland in the 1880s, as it was in parts of the UK, but it had nothing to do with,
that was happening in the other parts of Ireland, not just Ulster.
Well, it was happening in parts of the UK as well. It had nothing to do with...
Yeah,
it had nothing to do... It was capitalism gone mad. So it was basically, you're not making me any money renting my farm, so I'm going to get rid of you. I'm going to give it either to somebody else, or I'm going to mechanise it, or turn it off to sheep or whatever. So but that was a big thing in Ireland in the 1880s. That had nothing to do with Catholic versus Protestant. So that would still happen. So Ireland is still being in uproar, but then many parts of Europe are in uproar.
But what about that there were migrations?
Ditto the potato farming to a large extent.
Yeah. So I mean, that there were migrations to Ulster, and then there were. I'm sure you told me there were migrations back.
There was lots of reverse migrations because Ulster didn't. Ulster, like many places, was a largely rural economy. Yes, it had Belfast, which was economic, but nearby was Liverpool, relatively speaking. The west of Scotland in the 1880s was the boom in steelmaking and shipbuilding. Think about that's when people started building iron.
Yeah.
Ship.
Now, we can come on to whether that would have happened if
I think it would have done because many of the people who came in that era were Protestants, but many were also Catholics, and obviously so again they would have still come, but they just wouldn't have been Protestants.
No, I know, but one of the things which essentially I'm just countering that, and I mean I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened, but ultimately one of the things which drove industrialisation in Belfast was that there were a load of settlers who were Quakers, and they brought the cultivation of flax and linen and turned Belfast into this major linen-producing city. Now, if the Quakers hadn't have come because the plantation hadn't have enabled them to come, that may not have happened. And if that hadn't have happened, you haven't got the basis to then grow into the other industrialized industries that came as part of the Industrial Revolution. So it's not that it necessarily, I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened, but the drivers, because the plantation essentially pushed these Quakers to Northern Ireland, these Quakers into Ulster, created that sort of environment for industrialisation in that area. So if it wasn't there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would have driven it forward. So I personally think that Belfast wouldn't have been what it is today because the focus wouldn't have been there.
No, you're probably right.
I mean, this is just me reading the notes, and it was almost like, I didn't realise,
Which could have resulted in more migration from Ireland to the rest of Great Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just sorry. I'm sort of when you think of Ireland as being one nation, not two. It's trying to think of, you know what I mean in terms of not two. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been political issues. I mean, the issues in Ireland essentially were, unionist versus Republican rather than left versus.
Well, I'm not sure they were. I think they were Ireland versus England, but really England. The unionist thing didn't really pop up until the unionists saw what the potential. So I'm going back to my what's his name? But there's a famous person whose statue outside the William. But anyway, there was a famous unionist in the 1900s who raised these militias. One of which was the Ulster Defence Association, which became a terrorist organisation in the 90s. And they were armed. They drilled. They had weapons. Now they weren't previously battling Catholics in Dublin. They might have been horrible to their neighbours, but they weren't. They only raised up when they saw the prospect of Irish home. They didn't want to have an Irish state or an Irish federal body reporting to Great Britain. They wanted to be part of Great Britain. They still do. They wanted to be part of. They were more British than the British as they. So they only kind of really raised their head in a national sense when the prospect of being an independent or some form of independent state came along. So the battle the Irish had in inverted commas was mostly against the British, or they would call it the English, but in reality, so that battle. I don't think that battle changed as much. Whether it changes in brutality sense because you've got these people in the north who are prepared to do things in your homeland because there was terrorism in Dublin caused by these Ulster Unions. So it changes that, but the overall flow of what Ireland want is against moving out of the whole of London. Whether you've got Protestants in the north or not, that was kind of an irrelevance. So it becomes more. It's not an irrelevance until it's a problem. So it became a big problem, and they decided to do something about it. Hence, partitioned the 5 counties in a gerrymandered way to make it a Protestant majority and all the rest of it. So it becomes a problem when you actually try to solve something. But I think they were looking at one problem at a time, and they were hopeful. Many of the Irish politicians that the Ulster Unionists would wish to be part of the country, and there's an orange stripe in the flag of Ireland for a reason. So they came up with this flag of Ireland, and they realised that part of Ireland's history and existing timeline has within it Ulster Unionists who follow William as a symbol from themselves. So that they recognised that they were already Protestants there, and they wanted to be part of Ireland. Hence, they put the orange in the flag. That didn't go. They make it.
Well, that's right. So in that counterfactual, then would they still have the orange stripe? Do you think?
No, there wouldn't have been any. There wouldn't have been any Battle of the Boyne, and there wouldn't have been any William of Orange battling people in Ireland. Well, it might have been, but there might have been, but the whole of Ireland
would have been. It would have been.
There wouldn't have been any victors who consider themselves on the right side of the wrong side.
That's right. Yeah. One of the things that could have changed as well, just as a left field thing, certainly because I'm looking at it on our online dictionary that we use, was the language and the Ulster Scots dialect could have been different. So their actual accent wouldn't have been the way it is now. Because
the British Isles are a peculiar place. I can't speak, but I think it's fairly nice that the British Isles have a huge number of dialects and that.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is that the Northern Irish accent is probably heavily influenced by Scots. That's what
I said, but sadly some of the words are. But presumably, I never really understood.
Well, I suspect that I'm just
So I just had this come about, but you're right, and
it's just something that's in Wiki where it says one of the what the migration and the colonists did was a legacy in terms of language. That's all.
and then But I think the broad sweep of it is that the dispute or the problem with East Britain would still be there.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about that because it was still being ruled by Britain. So,
but the interesting thing is that Britain would have less of a what's that expression?
Skin in the game. Is that what you
Skin in the game? Like Britain, inverted commas, other than the usual story of class and privilege and money, wouldn't have any skin in the game. There would be no popular support of a British government, battling Irish people if there weren't for the fact it was 3 or 4 million or 2 who were very fearful of not being part of Britain, claimed to be very loyal, and realised they're only loyal to themselves, but loyal to the crown. So it's difficult to argue against that. You can't just abandon them. So so that then causes a problem. So 9 times out of 10, states trying to keep a status quo. If you haven't got a solution, what's the thing you do? Well, let's just keep it the same till we have got a solution. The solution of partition, which was a long way from being perfect. But that came up in the 1920s with Churchill and various people and.
I mean, arguably, we're obviously talking about there being no partition. So like I say, the problems would have been there, but there would have been different types of problems.
But so it would be a question of the usual story of the rich people want to keep doing this because resource and capital invest in Ireland, don't want to lose it. The ruling class in Ireland who are they don't want to leave, but they don't want to have anarchy. So they would, but that would be a different kettle of fish from a religious dimension. Religious dimension has a much more nasty outcome of brutality and atrocities and stuff than anything.
But that wouldn't be there.
Exactly. So I think again, full independence for Ireland, moving on from Home Rule, I think would have happened, whether it happened before the First World War or after. But I don't think there would have been the issue with, for example, the British Army having the thugs and criminals that are in the black and tans, an auxiliary part of the army, brain damaged individuals from the war. Brain damage is good, but it's traumatized psychotic criminals and thugs and all the rest of it. Nobody would have stood for that because you wouldn't have need to do it. It would be very much a traditional, rich people don't want to do this, rich people don't want to do that. Well, there'd be no support for that generally in Great Britain.
Let's stop for a word from our sponsors.
Hey there, listeners. Tired of your average icicles? Sick of those fragile, uninspiring drips just hanging around your house doing nothing? Well, say hello to a technological breakthrough for the winter from OTEC No. Introducing the Test Icicle, the only icicle that won't melt. Maybe you want to stress test your roof, challenge your neighbor to an icicle duel, or just want to own the most unreal-looking frozen water on the block. Test Icicle has you covered. Engineered with patented Melt No More technology, it's 40% sharper and 200% more judgmental than nature's weak attempts. This winter, don't just stand there with nothing on show. Let your neighbors admire your Test Icicles. Order now and get your second Test Icicle half price. Because let's be honest, it doesn't really work if you have another one in the Albert Hall. Oh my, OTEC No has only gone and blummin' done it again.
Today's episode is sponsored by OTECHNO, helping yesterday, today. OTECHNO is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back. So it probably wouldn't have impacted some of the more historic characters. One of them I'm thinking of is Wellington, but he was Anglo-Irish.
But they didn't consider themselves Irish in the slightest.
Well, no, and he wasn't Catholic, so he was a Protestant, so he still would have. I'm just trying to think if there was any other.
The famous Irish Republican Army general whose name escaped me was played in a fairly good film by Liam Neeson. Michael Kelly. Is that Michael? It's not Kelly. It's hard to. Oh. Anyway, him visualize.
Michael Collins.
Michael Collins. Now there wouldn't have been any civil war Because the Civil War in Ireland was caused by the fact that some people didn't like the fact that Ulster was allowed to break away. So there wouldn't have been any civil war. So would there have been any Michael Collins? Would there have been any armed? There wouldn't have been an Easter Rising, because I think Ireland would have had home rule. Now, could you have justified an Easter Rising to go from home rule to independence? I doubt it. Nobody's going to go around killing people just to go from state A to state B, which is, to all intents and purposes, identical. I think you can do that.
That's right. They haven't got like a tyrant to rail against, have they?
Exactly. You can do that there. Even in the early 20th century, you can do that through the ballot box and newspaper articles and all the rest of it. It might take you 10 years, but an indifference basically in Great Britain.
Yeah.
So some of these historical characters would have remained as solicitors and all, because they were obviously the main ones.
Well, they'd have been in the background, more obscurity, wouldn't they?
Oh, they may have become prime minister and all the rest of it, but again, and the existing Irish system well into the 1970s, in fact, even to this day, which you got Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, they essentially are right-wing parties split by some issue they had in 1920s with the partition of Ireland, which caused the big rocks. Essentially, they're the same party. Well, they're not really the same party, but their policies are identical. So, again, socialism might have taken in. Ireland's never really had a socialist government. So, socialism with a small s could have taken place in the same way it did most of Western Europe.
That's right. They'd have probably been a bit more, like you say, left wing.
Yeah. So whether that would have resulted in kicking the Irish church out quicker than it did, in terms of its influence on their society. Yeah, that the Irish church, riven through the whole of Irish society well into the late 1980s. It's only when a younger, more educated generation came along and is it dozens and dozens of scandals of horrendous sexual scandals and things with women who were in childbirth and not married and all the various things.
Well, that probably...
Would they have sorted it out at the same time the rest of Western Europe sorted out, which is really in the 1950s with the modernisation of society, really,
Probably not. I mean, it might have been worse. Who knows?
Why would it have been worse? If the Ireland had a socialist government or a socialist opposition every 5 years, the same way that many parts of Europe, Britain had socialist governments in the 60s.
Well, the only reason I say worse is that Ireland would have been a bigger area for the Catholic religion to spread things over.
Yeah, all right, but trust me, the Protestant churches in Northern Ireland are a bag of laughs. But
I'm not saying they are,
But because abortion was still illegal in Northern Ireland until 4 years ago, so and it only got through it only changed because of some COVID regulations, which was fortuitous. So it's a funny place in the best. They call themselves the rest of the same as part of Britain. Well, yes, they are, but that's by the by. So yeah, all right. So it's possible it could have been worse, but I don't think having I was in Dublin, and if you've got a socialist government in Ireland in the 1950s, they're because you've moved away from this. Just we're talking about Northern Ireland all the time. Maybe it would have been more liberal.
Yeah, arguably, at the end of the day, Ireland would have been it still is a fairly rural type country, and it would have been a rural country. Let's face it. Ireland's never been an industrial sort of powerhouse. So let's assume that Belfast isn't the industrial centre that it is. I mean, it still might be an industrial city, but it's not the big city that it is today or was, in the 20th century. So you've got that socialist type, which probably fits in with a rural sort of.
Well, it fits in the Scandinavian model, doesn't it? Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, missing one.
Yeah. So if we then move, let's move past the First World War then, and
which
Ireland
with religious nonsense. But they were never heavily Catholic in the first place, fair. But anyway, sorry.
That's right. So they become independent, and we go through the 20s and the 30s, and then we get to the Second World War. So what do we think the potential impact? In terms of, I'm pretty certain they wouldn't have suddenly started fighting.
Well, why not? So plenty of Irishmen did fight in the forces, not officially, and they were treated quite badly.
Well, I wasn't saying about. I'm not. Yeah, I was. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Or if you go back to our theory that if you haven't got the Ulster Genius poisoning the well in Westminster, which they've done for many a year, and we're doing quite recently as well. If you haven't got them poisoning the well and causing strife at home because they don't exist, Ireland has home rule in the 1900s. Ireland becomes independent in the 1920s. There's no civil war. There's no stigma. Obviously, you've got Oliver Cromwell and all that good stuff. Going back time,
Yeah, but then that argument, that's just. You'd like to think that becomes history then, rather than something that's a stick.
Well, indeed.
Carry on.
So you've got no recent gripe with your nearest neighbour.
Yeah.
Who's being attacked. You've previously helped them in the First World War. You've been, potentially means.
Well, you've allowed people to volunteer.
Well, if it's home rule, you wouldn't have any great deal. You would anyway, if it's opposed to independence. So I don't think the anti-English aspect would exist, or the anti-British aspect.
Well, I didn't say that they would fight for the Nazis. That was more of a.
No, I think they would certainly allow.
They probably would have been neutral, wouldn't they? Rather than
they were neutral already, but they were neutral in the timeline. But they would. I think they would have allowed. They would probably allowed American servicemen to stay there. Maybe British, probably not. But they would certainly allow. I think they might have allowed Royal Navy warships to be based in the west of Ireland, which was a major gripe of Churchill in the original timeline, because obviously. You
don't think they would have allowed U-boats to do anything, because that puts them on. That doesn't.
Why on earth would they do that? They didn't do that in the original timeline, and they didn't like the British at all. So.
Oh yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, it seems a bit.
I think they were never going to. The Second World War was mechanized, so they were never going to really contribute massively. They got manpower.
No.
But
there wouldn't have been any. You would have got people volunteering, but it wouldn't have been. I don't know how many.
It may have been similar to
taught in the Second
World War. I think, if you remove the sort of the timeline of the Civil War and it was caused by partition, and then the insurrection after the First World War, you remove that, and you've had a logical civil partnership of moving through home rule, independence, blah blah blah. You wouldn't have you really wouldn't have much of a gripe with the British, other than with the landed gentry, which is true in many parts of Europe. And I think whether they had a social government before the World War, probably not. There's quite a leap. But why would they be against it? Now, they may not have jumped into the war at the start, but when France fell and all the rest of it, and when the war in the Atlantic became very critical, and Britain said we would like to base warships in the west of Ireland, why would they say no?
Yeah. So, I mean...
why did they say no in the first place? But that's another story altogether. But strict neutrality. But to be fair, there was an awful lot of turning of blind eyes. There was bits where British maritime, even in the first time, the British maritime aircraft were flying over Ireland to go and patrol. Not that the Irish could do anything about it, but they were... The Irish government said it's okay with this enemy. But, an American aircraft, when British... combatants were interred in Ireland. A blind eye was turned eventually within a Northern Ireland, but that wasn't the case. Also, any aircraft landing in Germany and Ireland were different. So they were.
So were they? I didn't realise.
Yeah, Dublin was bombed.
Dublin
was bombed by mistake. Thinking
hell of a mistake then. Yeah.
Well,
where were they aiming? Belfast.
No, for a little. It's not really that far for the counties, but so
it is over the Irish Sea.
Well, indeed, but then you're flying above cloud.
I might have thought the River Mersey's a bit wide, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, that presumes it was at night over cloud. But but anyway, so lots. I don't know how many, but German aircraft landed in Ireland by mistake or were damaged and landed there. Ditto British aircraft. Many of the British aircraft did land there by mistake, obviously. From Northern Ireland. The pilot would be quietly sent back, but the plane wouldn't, obviously. So there was an awful lot of turning a blind eye in the original timeline. I think that'd been times hundreds in the real one, and I think near the end of the war, they were really fledged members, or certainly happy to have forces based there.
Okay, so I mean, it would arguably be something minor changes rather than anything significant.
We were talking about a country of 3
million. And there would have been changes, but yeah.
A country of 3 million people is not going to do anything massively major, and it's just...
No, that's right. So if we move it forward then, so you come past the Second World War. I mean, at the end of the day, Ireland as a single nation, not much else would have happened. I mean, the Troubles wouldn't have happened in the 70s. I mean, not much was happening in the 60s. I'm saying nothing was happening in the 60s, but there was nothing, major from a major conflict perspective.
There was a little blowing up post boxes and things, but there was stuff going on, but nothing.
Yeah, so the Troubles just wouldn't have happened. There'd have been just not something we'd ever talk about. It makes you so. I think that your analogy of Ireland being like a Scandinavian country is a good one. Makes you wonder where they would go in a modern, an island nation which is largely rural. But let's face it, doesn't have any oil. There's there's no oil in around Ireland, is there? Or not, as far as I'm aware. All the
Gas.
islands.
There is some gas. There's gas, but again, in the great scheme of things, no, it doesn't have a huge amount of resources. Hence why it didn't industrialise them any coal.
Yeah. So it still would be a fairly small,
Yeah.
rural country. I'm trying to think of whereas the Scandinavian ones are more industrialised or have been in the 20th century, later 20th century, even Finland, would Ireland have done that? Who knows? Whether they.
Well, actually, Ireland did do that. The Celtic Tiger and all that. It's not all. It wasn't. I mean, the original boom of the 1990s wasn't around sucking up to ugly arts and giving them tax breaks. I mean, they had an incredibly well-educated population. There's two things that happen with that. Half them leave and then half them stay. The ones that stay, X% of them, less than 1%.
No, I know, but it's almost like, okay, so what brands would you? If you talk about Finland, you talk about Nokia. Nokia, generated a significant amount for a country roughly the same sort of size, 2-3 million people, but its GDP was based on a lot of technology like that. What's the equivalent in Ireland then?
I don't know, but people in Ireland have a very good standard of living. Probably better than the rest of Great Britain now, to be honest.
Well, now, but then a lot of that is because in the 21st century, a lot of that's because they've got these big companies that have got good tax breaks.
Well, but that's a relatively that's the last.
No, so that's what I'm saying. So what? So
yeah,
okay. So I didn't research.
I mean,
many of GDP.
Many of the major brands that you consider, they may not manufacture stuff in Ireland, but they've certainly got research establishments, physical places. I mean, but Dublin's quite a.
It might be the way that they created industry.
And obviously, it's part of the EU, or the EEC as it was originally when he joined. They got lots of grants to modernise their infrastructure. I mean, I've been to Ireland a couple of times. I mean, it was the first time 1994, and then 10 years later. And the amount of everywhere seemed to be dual carriageways, and they all seemed new. They all build it and they come. So they obviously got a lot of money from the EU through the correct process to build infrastructure. That wouldn't have changed.
So we're saying that there'd be no difference then, or little difference.
No.
Fair enough. If there's little difference, there's little difference. I mean, obviously with Brexit, we wouldn't have an issue with Northern Ireland and
yeah, but Ireland hasn't got a problem with Brexit. It's the Ulster Unionists have got a problem with.
No, I know. Yeah. So would that have created? I don't know what impact that it would have had an impact.
That wasn't caused by Brexit as such. That was caused by the rubbish deal that Boris Johnson negotiated.
Well, yeah, but the deal would have been different. So that's all.
Well, if we'd stayed in the custody, it wouldn't have made any difference at all. And that wasn't.
No.
Some nutters will have you believe that wasn't on the ballot paper.
No. I'm just saying that it was, focus of a lot of attention, and it wouldn't have existed. And I don't know how many people, in terms of the voted for Brexit. I'm assuming most of them. Well, I don't know. Don't know what the vote in Ireland, in Northern Ireland was. If you took their numbers out,
it wasn't pro-Brexit. Although the Ulster Unionists were flagged were in favour of it. So I'd be for if it was swearing, but the mildly swearing, but the
I might beep it out. Test my editing ability.
Flag beep. No, it wasn't pro-Brexit.
All right, so so removing their votes wouldn't have changed anything.
Well, the thing about I mean, the thing about the interesting about about that, we're going off a wee bit of a tangent of podcast, but is that the hypocrisy of it, because people in the north of Ireland, even if they're Northern Ireland rather, even if they're Protestant or wherever, can still get an Irish passport and can fly around and live in Europe as a member of the EU. So they had a bit of a get. So get a bit of a get out of jail card, because anybody in Northern Ireland to become an Irish citizen of dual citizenship is not a problem.
Right. Fair enough.
Well, why wouldn't you? Why would you? Apart from anything else, how could you just allow it for Catholics in Ireland and not give it to Protestants and vice versa? So that would look a bit peculiar. It's against the United Nations Charter. Apart from anything,
no, that's
discriminate.
Right. Well, in the counterfactual, they would have all had an Irish passport anyway.
Well, indeed. Well, no, but
that's right.
Some choose, but
So we're getting to the end now. Interesting. It's one of those periods in history, like we said at the beginning, not many people knew. Oh, well, I suspect not many people even have heard of it. But, would have had some potential significant impacts in Ireland. Yeah, it might not have had much of an impact anywhere else, but certainly in Ireland it would have had a large impact.
Well, the thing is, the interesting thing for once.
For once?
Right, for once.
I guess.
Had a highly positive outcome. I think it was the world a little bit nicer.
It would, yeah. I mean, yeah, you could argue that these earls who left were being very well. Obviously there was a reason why they left. Yeah, I think if we can find little things like this where it's unknown, you think, well, it would have had a significant impact.
And it does.
In that area.
It does put to the lie the simplistic view of Britain out of Ireland, because obviously Britain's been in Ireland since 1605, if not earlier. So it's so simplistic views of certain politicians in parts of North America, not Canada, that you could just do X, Y, and Z with the Brits in Ireland. Well, sorry, you tell us how you're going to unravel all this. Go on, after next.
And on that bombshell, right? So that's another one in the bag. Another one for our chart-topping podcast. I'm going to keep saying it because the more you say it, the more people will believe it. Prove us wrong.
Tony Blackburn. Da, 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 da. And number one.
And number one in the...
And also number two. Was number 3 and 4 and 5, coincidentally, but never mind it.
Well, unless we actually find another counterfactual podcast. Then who knows? There may be one out there. Doesn't have to be English speaking. Who knows? You never know. Keep saying no. Anyway, that's it for now. We've got more exciting podcasts coming up. So please subscribe if you can and listen out for our subsequent episodes. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
And that's it. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. But after listening to us natter on, why not let us know what you think? Find us on Blue Sky by searching for Chats in Time. On Facebook, search ORC Time. And on X, we are ORC_time. Until next time, cheerio!